After my mother made me cancel my wedding because she didn't approve of my fiancé, I moved away. Years later, I returned with a life she couldn't control, and the truth I revealed at a family dinner left her shattered. I remember standing in front of the mirror, the ivory fabric of my wedding dress brushing softly against the floor, every bead and seam meticulously chosen. I wasn't the girl who had dreamed about a big wedding, but there I was, trying on what was supposed to be the happiest garment of my life. I didn't feel happy. The pit in my stomach had been growing for weeks. Outside the fitting room, I could hear my mother's voice, sharp-clipped and impatient. She never was one for subtlety. "Tell her to hurry up," she hissed to the poor attendant. "There's no point in trying this on when it's never going to happen." Her words were like acid in the air, and they stung. But they didn't surprise me. She'd made it clear from day one that she didn't approve of Jake, my fiancé. No matter what he did, it was never good enough. He worked hard, too hard, in her eyes. And she thought his ambitions would keep me from having the perfect family life she'd always imagined for me. I didn't care. I loved him. Or at least I thought I did. I walked out of the fitting room, dressed in the gown that would never see the light of day at an altar. My mother barely glanced up from her phone. "Let's go," she said, her tone final. "You're cancelling this nonsense." I opened my mouth to argue, but the words caught in my throat. I was 26, a grown woman, and yet I felt like a child in that moment. She had that power over me, always had. She'd raised me to believe that her way was the only way. I didn't even realize how deep her hooks were in me until I was standing there, trying to find the courage to tell her to back off, and I couldn't. That night, Jake and I sat in my tiny apartment, our future crumbling around us. His eyes were hollow, as if he'd already known this was coming. Maybe he had. "I can't do this," I whispered, the weight of the decision pressing down on my chest. "I can't go against her." He didn't fight, he didn't yell. He just stood up, grabbed his jacket, and left. And that was it. My mother had won, again. 2 weeks later, I packed my bags and left town. I didn't give her the satisfaction of an explanation. I just disappeared. Moved across the country to a small coastal town where I could breathe without her constant judgment. I cut off contact with almost everyone in my family, except my younger brother, Ethan. He understood, in a way that no one else did. We had both been raised under the shadow of her control, but he was always better at playing the game. He stayed close, kept her happy, but he never judged me for leaving. For nearly 5 years, I lived a quiet life, far away from the chaos that had once consumed me. I rebuilt myself from the ground up, piece by piece, free from her suffocating grip. I made friends who didn't know my past, who didn't judge me for the decisions I had made. I had relationships, some serious, some fleeting, but none of them carried the same weight as what I had shared with Jake. I found work as a photographer, capturing moments of other people's lives, weddings, families, births, ironically documenting the milestones I had once dreamed of for myself. My own life felt lighter, more untethered than it had ever been. But all of that changed with one phone call. It was Ethan. "Mom's not doing well," he said quietly. "It's bad, sis, you should come home." The dread I felt driving back to that small, suffocating town was overwhelming. It had been nearly 5 years since I'd left, 5 years without a word, 5 years of learning to breathe again without her suffocating presence. I wasn't sure how she would react when she saw me again, or if I even cared, but something in Ethan's voice had tugged at me, and I couldn't ignore it. When I pulled into the driveway of my childhood home, the house looked exactly the same, pristine, cold, and unwelcoming. My mother's kingdom. Ethan was already waiting at the door, his face grim. "Is she really sick?" I asked, trying to gauge the seriousness of the situation. Ethan hesitated, then nodded. "Yeah, it's cancer, late stage." The words hit me like a sledgehammer. I had imagined this moment differently. I had imagined facing her with all my newfound strength, showing her the woman I had become without her influence. But cancer? That wasn't the enemy I had prepared for. It wasn't the battle I'd expected. Still, I walked inside. My mother looked smaller, frailer, but her eyes were still sharp. When she saw me standing in the doorway of her bedroom, her eyes flickered with something, surprise, maybe even recognition, but it didn't last. She pursed her lips, her voice still sharp despite her weakened state. "Well, I didn't think you'd come crawling back, but I suppose it was only a matter of time." Her words landed like barbs, but this time, they didn't sink in, not like they used to. For a moment, I thought I might feel some shred of sympathy for her, lying there weak and sick, but instead I just felt nothing. For the next week, I played the dutiful daughter. Ethan and I took turns taking care of her, watching as she grew weaker. She still managed to manipulate, though. Even in her fragile state, she found ways to criticize everything I did, the way I dressed, the way I spoke, the fact that I had never married. "Maybe if you hadn't been so impulsive, you'd have a family of your own by now," she said one evening as I brought her dinner. "But you always did make the wrong choices." I clenched my jaw and walked out of the room. She didn't deserve the truth yet. Not until I was ready. The day came when Ethan suggested we invite the extended family over for dinner. "A final gathering before things got worse," he said. My mother agreed, of course. She always loved an audience. The house filled with familiar faces, cousins, aunts, uncles, most of whom hadn't seen me since I'd disappeared. They all pretended to be happy to see me, but I could feel the judgment in their eyes, the unspoken questions about my life, my absence. Dinner started off tense, the conversation stilted and awkward. My mother, despite her condition, managed to command the table, as always. She held court, offering sharp observations and veiled criticisms of everyone around her. But there was something different this time, something bitter in her tone, as if she could sense that her grip on us all was slipping. And then, when the dessert plates had been cleared, she turned to me. "So," she began, her voice louder than necessary, "I suppose now that you're back we can finally talk about what you've been doing all these years. Or should I say, who?" The room went silent. I smiled, a slow, deliberate smile. This was the moment I had been waiting for. "You're right, Mom," I said, leaning back in my chair. "It's time to talk about my life." Ethan shot me a wary glance, his face a mixture of concern and resignation. He'd spent years trying to keep the peace between us, but even he knew this was a battle long overdue. I ignored him. This was between me and her. "For starters, I'm not the same girl who left," I continued, my voice steady. "I've changed. A lot. And I've found happiness, real happiness, something you wouldn't recognize." Her eyes narrowed, and I could see the frustration building in her. She wasn't used to me talking back. Not like this. "And as for who I've been with, well, you'll find this interesting." I reached into my bag and pulled out a photograph, sliding it across the table toward her. She stared at it for a moment, her eyes widening in confusion. What is this?" she asked, her voice unsteady for the first time. "That's my family," I said, my voice dripping with satisfaction. "My real family." The picture showed me, standing with a woman and a little boy, both of them smiling beside me. My wife and our son. The table erupted into whispers, gasps of disbelief, but I kept my eyes locked on my mother's face. "You see," I said slowly, savoring each word, "I didn't need your approval. I didn't need your idea of a perfect life. I found my own. And it's more beautiful than anything you could have ever given me." Her hands trembled as she reached for the photograph, her eyes scanning it as though the image might change if she stared long enough. And then the color drained from her face. In that instant, the truth shattered her world. I wasn't hers to control anymore. I never had been. You're a disgrace," she spat, her voice trembling with rage. I leaned forward, my voice cold as ice. "No, Mom, I'm free." She collapsed into herself, the fight draining from her eyes as the weight of it all crashed down on her. The room was dead silent, everyone watching as the woman who had always been in control, who had dictated the course of so many lives, was left shattered by the one person she had never expected to defy her. I stood up, feeling a lightness I had never known. Ethan caught my eye, his expression unreadable, but there was a flicker of pride in his gaze. Without another word, I left the table, leaving behind the wreckage of a family bound by control and fear. I had broken free, and I wasn't looking back. 3 months later, my mother was gone. She died the same way she'd lived, alone, in a house filled with things but no love. I never saw her again after that night, and I never regretted it. When the call came, there was no sorrow, only silence. I was free, and for the first time in my life, I didn't have to apologize for it. Ethan sent me a message a few days after the funeral. I hadn't attended. He said there were whispers, questions, judgments, mostly from the extended family. But none of it mattered. For once, I wasn't their concern. They couldn't control me anymore. And in the quiet, I smiled. I was finally living my life on my own terms.